Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're not going back to the past to admire it exactly. We're going back to stand beside a woman who lived it, who made her beds and kept her schedules and measured her days in coffee percolations and casserole timings, and we're going to imagine, just for a little while, what she would think if she could see the world you are living in right now. Before we begin, thank you. Genuinely, sincerely, thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You sent me a message that said something like, I keep thinking about how my grandmother would react to everything we just accept as normal now, and I could not stop thinking about it either. That is exactly the kind of idea that makes this channel worth building, and I am so grateful you shared it. If you are watching and you have a topic you want to explore, drop it in the comments. You shape this more than you know. And if you are listening on Spotify, hello, welcome. I am so glad you found us. The link is in the description if you want to share it with someone who might love a quiet listen like this. If this is your first time here, take a second to like and subscribe. It truly helps more than I can explain, and it means this little corner of history gets to keep growing. Now, if you have not already, dim the lights a little. Put on a fan if you have one. Make yourself something warm if that sounds good. We are going to be here for a while. 'Cause here is what I want you to think about before we begin. What did a woman in 1962 actually believe about the future? Not the science fiction future, not rockets and robots, but the quiet, domestic future. Did she think the telephone would ever leave the wall? Did she imagine a day when a woman might eat dinner alone, not out of sadness, but simply out of preference, watching something on a screen she held in her hand? Did she think a family could exist without a single handwritten letter passing between them for years? Did she think a kitchen could hum along without a housewife running it? She could not have imagined any of it. And yet, here you are. And just like that, it is 1962. The percolator is going in the kitchen. The morning paper is still damp from the front porch. Someone down the street is beating a rug, and the sound drifts in through the screen door like a soft, familiar rhythm. She has a full day ahead of her. She always does. And she has absolutely no idea what is coming. You're standing in her kitchen, and she is watching you with the particular expression she reserves for things she does not quite understand. Polite, patient, and faintly suspicious. You've just pulled your phone from your pocket and told her that this small, flat, glass rectangle contains every song ever recorded, every book ever published, every piece of news happening anywhere on Earth at this exact moment. A camera, a map that knows exactly where you are, a way to speak to anyone you love in seconds, and a light bright enough to read by at 3 a.m. She sets down her dish towel. She looks at the phone. She looks back at you. And then, very quietly, she says, "And what does it cost to keep something like that?" Because in her world, everything useful has a price, and the more useful it is, the more it costs to maintain. You tell her what it costs per month, and she does the arithmetic immediately, the way women of her era always do arithmetic quietly and accurately, translating the number into something she can measure. "That is more than the electric bill," she says, and you nod, because it is. She picks up her dish towel again and turns it over in her hands, thinking. She is not dismissing the thing. She's trying to place it somewhere in her understanding of the world, trying to find the drawer it belongs in, and discovering that no such drawer exists. She would want to hold it. You know she would. She would take it carefully, the way she takes anything fragile or unfamiliar, with both hands and a particular steadiness. She would turn it over and look at the back of it, then the front. She would notice that it has no buttons she can find. She would press the edge of her thumb to the glass and startle slightly when the screen woke up beneath her touch. And in that moment, the kitchen would go very quiet, just the percolator finishing its last few drips and the sound of a car passing on the street outside, and she would stand there holding the entire connected world in her two hands without quite knowing it. You would show her a photograph on it, something simple, a picture of a child perhaps, or a dog, or a street she might recognize. And she would lean in close the way she leans in to read a recipe she has not quite memorized, and she would say, "Well, that is very clear," because it is. The photographs are clearer than anything she has ever seen printed on paper, sharper than the pictures in her best magazines, sharper than the portraits in the frames on her own walls. And that clarity would unsettle her in a way she could not entirely explain, as if something had been made too precise, too immediate, as if the small, comfortable distance between a moment and its memory had been removed entirely. She would ask you where you keep the photographs when the phone is full. You would explain that they live somewhere she cannot see or touch, in a place. The particular gentle concern of a woman who has been taught that a person who does not seek company must be in some kind of trouble. In her world, the middle of the day is when the neighbourhood breathes. It is when the back doors open and the voices carry across the yards. It is when someone appears at the screen door to return a borrowed pan and stays for 40 minutes because the coffee is already made and there is no real reason to rush. The afternoon is not empty time, it is social time, the unhurried, unofficial kind that does not get written on a calendar, but holds everything together nonetheless, the way thread holds a hem, invisible and necessary. She learned this from her own mother, who learned it from hers. You do not leave a woman to her own company in the middle of the day if you can help it. You call, you stop in, you bring something, even if it is only the excuse of returning something borrowed, because the visit is the point, and the borrowed item is just the door you knock on to begin it. Loneliness, in her experience, is not something that announces itself. It accumulates quietly, in the spaces between people, in the afternoons that pass without a voice in them. She would sit down across from you, because that is what she would do. She would pour herself a cup of whatever you had going, and she would ask you about your morning, and she would listen, and she would tell you something about hers, and by the time the cups were empty, the afternoon would have changed shape entirely. It would feel inhabited, warm, like a room someone has been living in rather than just passing through. You would find, sitting there with her, that there is a pleasure in it you had forgotten, or perhaps never fully learned. The pleasure of a conversation that goes nowhere important, that does not accomplish anything, that exists only because two people happen to be in the same kitchen at the same hour, and neither of them left. There is a word for what she is doing, that her world never needed to name because it was simply what people did. You might struggle to find it now, but you would feel it clearly, sitting at that table with the afternoon light coming through the curtains and nowhere particular to be. She would refill your cup without asking. She would stay another 20 minutes. And when she finally stood to go, smoothing her skirt and saying something about needing to start dinner, you would sit for a moment in the quiet she left behind, and the quiet would feel different than the quiet before she arrived. Fuller somehow, more like rest and less like absence. That is what she would give you, without meaning to give you anything at all, just the ordinary, unremarkable gift of not being alone in the middle of the day. She would not understand that you had forgotten it was possible. In her world, The grocery closes at 5 on weekdays, at noon on Saturdays, and does not exist at all on Sundays, because Sunday is Sunday and the stores know it and the town knows it, and everyone has made their preparations accordingly. She plans for this. She thinks ahead. She keeps her pantry in a state of careful readiness, never caught without flour, never without a tin of something that could become dinner in a pinch. The idea that a person could walk into a brightly lit store at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday to buy a single lime and a box of crackers would have seemed to her less like convenience and more like evidence that no one in the future was planning anything at all. She writes her grocery list the way she writes everything, deliberately, in the same neat hand she uses for thank you notes, organised by the layout of the store so that she moves through it efficiently without backtracking. She knows which day the bread is freshest. She knows which checker is fastest and which one will want to talk, and she chooses between them based on how much time she has and how much she feels like being known that morning. Shopping, for her, is not an errand. It is a small, competent act of management, and she takes it seriously the way she takes everything seriously that keeps her household running well. The pantry itself is something she's quietly proud of, not in a way she would ever say aloud, but in the way she opens its door sometimes and simply looks at it, at the ordered rows of canned goods and paper packages and glass jars with their handwritten labels, and feels something that is close to satisfaction. She is ready. Whatever comes, she is ready. There is a security in a full pantry that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with a certain kind of competence, the competence of a woman who does not wait to be caught unprepared. She would find the 24-hour grocery store genuinely astonishing. She would walk through it at a normal hour, perhaps on a Saturday morning, and she would move slowly, the way she moves through anything she's trying to understand, taking it in with that same patient attention she brings to everything unfamiliar. She would notice the abundance first, the sheer volume of it, the walls of it, the fact that there are 14 kinds of the same thing, and that all 14 are available all the time, not seasonally, not occasionally, but always, as if scarcity had simply been decided against. She would stop in front of the bread aisle. There would be an entire aisle. She would stand there for a moment, reading the labels, counting the varieties, holding a loaf of something she would not recognize and turning it over to look at the list of ingredients, a list so long and so full of words she could not pronounce that she would set it back carefully, as if it had told her something she needed a moment to think about. What she would take from the visit, more than anything, is the feeling that the future has solved certain problems in ways that have quietly created others. The store never closes, yes. Nothing ever runs out. You never have to plan ahead or keep a careful pantry or know which day the bread is fresh. But something has been lost in the knowing, some small daily practice of foresight and preparation that made a person feel, in a modest and private way, like they were running something, like they were in charge of something, like the household ran because they thought ahead, and the thinking ahead was part of what it meant to keep a home. She would carry her list to the checkout, she would thank the clerk, she would push her cart into the parking lot and stand for a moment in the ordinary morning air thinking. Then she would say, almost to herself, "I suppose it is good not to run out of things," and you would know from the way she said it that she was not entirely sure it was. She spends more hours in her kitchen than in any other room of her house. She knows its sounds the way a sailor knows weather, the particular hiss of the percolator when the coffee is almost ready, the way the oven door closes differently when something is in it, the tick of the timer she does not always need, because she has counted these minutes so many times her body simply knows. Her kitchen is not just where food is made. It is where the day is organised, where the family reconvenes, where the quiet management of an entire household takes place, invisibly, competently, every single day. To hear that a person might live comfortably for years with little more than a microwave and a drawer full of take-out menus would not just surprise her. It would feel, to her, like hearing that someone had decided to skip the foundation and build the house anyway. She would want to see your kitchen. You know she would. She would stand in the doorway of it the way she stands in the doorway of any room she is assessing, taking it in before she enters, reading it the way she reads most things, quietly and completely. She would notice what was there and what was not. She would see the microwave and she would study it without touching it. She would open the refrigerator with the careful permission of a guest and look at what was inside, not judging, exactly, but cataloguing, the way a doctor looks at something and notes what it tells them. She would ask you what you made for dinner last week, not to catch you in anything, just because that is how she understands a life, through its meals, through the evidence of what a person fed themselves and the people they love, through the question of whether there was a table and whether someone sat at it. If you told her you ordered in 3 nights and skipped dinner twice and had cereal once standing at the counter, she would not say anything immediately. She would close the refrigerator. She would look at the counter, at the clean, empty expanse of it, undusted by flour, unstained by anything, as blank as a room that has not been used. And she would understand something about your life that you might not have thought to say directly, that the kitchen has become a room you pass through rather than a room you live in, and that somewhere in that change something about the shape of the day has shifted too. She knew women who could not cook. She was not unkind about it, but she understood cooking as something beyond the making of food. She understood it as attention, as the daily practice of turning raw things into something nourishing, of caring enough about the people at your table, or even just about yourself to spend the time. The kitchen was where that caring became visible, where it became real in the smell of something browning, and the weight of a pot, and the particular satisfaction of a meal that came together the way you planned it, or even better, the way you improvised it from what you had. She would roll up her sleeves without being asked. She would look in your cabinets and find whatever was there, and she would make something from it, because that is what she does, because a kitchen is only a room until someone decides to use it, and she has never been the kind of woman who leaves a room unused when there is work to be done in it. And she would not say anything grand while she cooked. She would just cook. She would move through your kitchen the way she moves through her own, with a quiet efficiency that looks effortless because it has been practiced 10,000 times. She would hand you something to do, not because she needed the help, but because she understood that the best thing you can give someone in a kitchen is a reason to stand in it. By the time the food was ready, the kitchen would smell like something, like a room that had been used, like a place where a person lived. You would sit down to eat it and feel, without quite knowing why, that something had been returned to you. Divorce, in her world, is not a quiet thing. It is an event with weight and consequence and a particular kind of shame that settles over a household like weather. It is discussed in lowered voices. It changes how the neighbours speak to you at the mailbox. It follows a woman down the street, trailing after her like something she cannot quite shake off her shoe. She does not know anyone who's been divorced more than once. She barely knows anyone who's been divorced at all, at least not anyone who speaks of it plainly. The idea that two people might separate amicably, divide their furniture calmly, and both appear at the same school function a year later, with new partners and pleasant expressions, would have read to her not like progress, but like a dream where all the rules of gravity had been quietly suspended. She married young, the way most women of her time married, with a certainty that was part faith and part social expectation and part the simple fact that this was the shape a life was supposed to take. She did not go into it naively. She went into it knowing that marriage was work, that it required tending the way a garden requires tending, that there would be seasons of it that were harder than others, and that the hardness was not a signal to leave but a reason to stay and figure it out. She was prepared for that. She was raised for it. What she was not prepared for is the world you live in, where the leaving has become easier than the staying, where the legal machinery of ending a marriage can be set in motion with a form and a fee and a relatively polite conversation between two lawyers, where the word divorce has lost most of its gravity and become something closer to a neutral event, like moving to a different city, something that happens and is processed and is moved past with a reasonable efficiency. She would not think this was entirely wrong. She was not a woman without compassion. She knew women in her own neighbourhood whose marriages were not good, whose husbands were not kind, who wore their unhappiness like a second skin, and said nothing about it because there was nothing to be said and nowhere to go. She understood, on some level she would never say aloud, that the permanence she believed in came at a cost that not everyone paid equally. But she would still feel the strangeness of it, the ease of it, the way a thing that was once considered one of the most serious decisions a person could make has become, in your time, something that can be undone with relatively little ceremony. She would think about what that does to the beginning of things, whether knowing that the door is always there changes how hard you push against the wall, whether the vow means something different when everyone knows it is revocable. She would not say this to you directly. She would say something smaller, something careful, something like, "I suppose people are happier for it." And then she would be quiet for a moment, looking at her own hands, at the ring she's worn so long it has left a slight impression in the skin beneath it, and you would understand that she was not talking about other people at all. She would not trade her life. You would feel certain of that. But she would hold the question of yours with the gentleness that came from understanding something you might not have fully considered, that the freedom to leave is real and sometimes necessary, and that it changes the nature of the choosing in ways both better and harder than she would be able to say. Dinner comes from her kitchen, or on special occasions, from a restaurant where a waitress with a notepad and a practiced smile comes to the table and listens while you say what you want out loud, like a human being. The exchange is brief, but it is real. Someone is there. Someone takes note. Someone brings what you asked for. When she and her husband go out to eat, which is not often, it is an occasion. She wears something nice. She does not look at the menu the way you look at something on a screen. She holds it in both hands and reads it with the pleasant seriousness of a woman who intends to choose well. The idea of sitting alone in a kitchen, pressing small pictures on a glowing screen, and having a bag of warm food appear at the front door 30 minutes later, delivered by a stranger who does not knock but simply leaves it on the porch, would have seemed to her not like ease but like an elaborate way of making sure you never had to speak to anyone at all. She would want to understand the mechanics of it. She would ask you to show her, and you would open the app on your phone and show her the grid of photographs, all those pictures of food glowing in the palm of your hand, and she would bend over the screen and look at each one the way she looks at the photographs in her recipe books, with a focused, assessing attention. "That looks good," she would say, pointing to something, and for a moment you would both just be two people looking at food together, and it would feel almost ordinary. But then you would tap the button, and it would be ordered, and she would look at you and say, "That is all?" And you would say yes, and she would straighten up and think about that, about the fact that no voice was used and no paper exchanged hands. No one looked at anyone. The whole transaction completed without a single moment of human contact beyond your thumb against the glass. She would not be entirely opposed to the outcome. She was a practical woman, and she understood the value of convenience. But she would notice something about the experience that you have likely stopped noticing, which is that something has been removed from it. A small friction, a small necessity of engagement, the moment of being known by the person who takes your order, even briefly, even as a stranger, even for the duration of a Tuesday dinner. In her world, those small moments of being seen were not extras. They were the texture of a day. They were the difference between moving through the world and moving through a pantomime of it. She would eat the food you ordered without complaint. She would say it was good if it was good, and she would mean it. But halfway through the meal she would glance at the door, at the place on the porch where the bag had been set down by someone who never knocked, and she would feel something she might call wistfulness. But that was really something simpler than that. She would just be missing the waitress, the real one with the notepad, who asked how you were doing tonight and meant it more or less, and who brought the coffee without being asked because she had been watching and she knew. It is a small thing to miss. You might not have known you missed it yourself until she named it without naming it, just by glancing at the door. Summer in her world belongs to the outside. The moment school lets out, the children go out the back door and into the neighbourhood, ranging as far as their legs will carry them, and coming home when the light changes colour and the suppers start to smell like they are nearly ready. She does not track them through the hours. She trusts the neighbourhood the way she trusts the calendar. She trusts that children know how to make the day into something, that boredom is not a crisis but a beginning, that the empty afternoon is where imagination starts. The idea of a child spending an entire June day inside in an air-conditioned room, bathed in the blue light of a screen, without a single grass stain or scraped knee, would have worried her in a way she might not have been able to name precisely, but would have felt in her bones like something important going untended. She knows what boredom does to a child who is left alone with it long enough. She has watched it happen in her own yard, the restless circling that starts after lunch on a long summer day, the complaining that there is nothing to do, and then, almost without warning, the click of something catching, a stick becoming something, a puddle becoming something, two children who an hour ago had nothing becoming architects of an entire afternoon. She has never been tempted to rescue a bored child from the boredom. She understands it as the thing that comes just before the invention. She would step outside on a summer morning in your neighbourhood and listen. She would hear the air conditioning units and the distant sound of traffic and the birds, which are still there, still going about their business regardless. But she would not hear children. She would look up and down the street and the yards would be empty, the way yards in her time were only empty in February, and she would feel the absence the way you feel a sound that has stopped, the particular silence of something that used to be there. She would ask you where they all were, the children, and you would explain carefully about the screens and the programs and the supervised activities and the concern about safety, and she would listen to all of it with the attentive patience she brings to things she is trying to understand. And she would nod, because she would understand each individual reason you gave her. She would not disagree with any one of them, but she would still go back to the empty yards. She would think about what it meant to be 7 years old in July with nothing planned and nowhere to be, and the whole afternoon opening out in front of you like a field you had not crossed yet. She would think about the kind of person that afternoon makes, the resourcefulness of it, The scraped-knee confidence of a child who has spent a summer solving problems no adult set for them, who knows how to negotiate and improvise and fail at something small and recover before dinner. She would not lecture you about it. She was never a woman who lectured, but she would find a ball in the garage or a jump rope or something, and she would bring it outside and sit on the front step with it, and she would wait. Not for long, because children, she's always known, come toward a thing that is real and physical and unheld by anyone, the way water finds the lowest point. It is what they are made for, and eventually a door would open somewhere on the street, and a child would come outside, blinking in the summer light, a little uncertain, looking around at the ordinary July afternoon, and she would hold up the ball, and the afternoon would begin. She does not own the word casual the way you do. Going out means something in her wardrobe. It means particular care, a certain standard that has nothing to do with vanity, and everything to do with respect, for the errand, for the neighbour she might pass, for herself. She would never go to the pharmacy in the clothes she slept in. She would never pick up the children from school in house slippers. The idea of a woman moving through an airport in clothes that look like pyjamas, rolling a suitcase behind her without a scarf or a pressed anything, would not strike her as freedom. It would strike her as something closer to sadness, a world in which no one felt that the act of going out into it was worth preparing for. Getting dressed in her world is not vanity. It is vocabulary. The clothes a woman wears when she leaves her house are a sentence she is writing about herself, about how she sees herself, about what she believes she owes the world and what the world owes her. She does not dress to impress anyone in particular. She dresses because she is going somewhere, and going somewhere means you represent something, yourself, your household, the quiet standard you hold yourself to in the small daily acts that nobody notices until they stop. She has a coat she wears to the grocery store, and a different coat she wears to church, and a third one for appointments, and the differences between them would look small to you but are not small to her. They mark the occasion. They say, "I knew where I was going and I prepared for it." There is a dignity in that preparation that she would find very hard to articulate if you asked her to, because to her it does not need articulating any more than brushing her teeth needs articulating. It is simply what you do before you go out into the world. She would watch you leave the house in the clothes you slept in, heading somewhere ordinary, the coffee shop or the pharmacy or wherever the morning required, and she would be quiet about it the way she is quiet about most things that confuse her. She would not say anything you did not ask her to say. But she would feel something, a faint and genuine puzzlement at the idea that the boundary between the private and the public self had grown so thin in your time, so permeable, that a person could move from their bed to the street with nothing changed between them. She would understand that comfort is not nothing. She was not a woman who confused suffering with virtue. She understood the pleasure of soft things and easy mornings, but she would tell you, if you asked her, that there was a comfort she found in the getting dressed that had nothing to do with the clothes themselves. It was the moment of transition, the small ceremony of it, the act of looking at yourself in the mirror before you left and deciding, yes, this is how I am going out today. This is who I am presenting to the morning. You might not have a word for what that gives you until you have gone without it long enough. She would have noticed the absence before you did. She was that kind of woman. She writes letters the way she breathes, regularly, without making a production of it, because it is simply what you do when you care about someone who is not in the room with you. She has a drawer of stationery. She knows her aunt's handwriting the same way she knows their voices. She waits for letters. The waiting is part of it. The particular satisfaction of seeing an envelope with a familiar return address sitting in the mailbox, proof that someone sat down and thought of her long enough to fill a page. The idea that a person might go years without receiving a single handwritten letter from anyone, without anyone going to the effort of addressing an envelope and trusting the mail with something personal, would have felt to her like a great and quiet loss that the world had simply decided not to mourn. She knows the difference between the kinds of letters people write. There are the short ones, the notes, really. Just a few lines to say the package arrived, or the visit was lovely, or the children are well. There are the longer ones, the ones that take a whole evening, where you sit down after dinner with a good pen and you let the thinking go somewhere it does not usually go, where you tell someone something true that you would not quite say out loud. And there are the rare ones, the ones that come at strange times and say something you did not know someone was carrying, something you will read twice and then put back in its envelope and keep. She has a box of letters in the top of her closet. She does not look at them often, but she knows they are there, the way you know certain things are there, as a kind of ballast, proof that people loved her in words they took the time to write down. When she does take the box out, perhaps on a winter afternoon when the house is quiet, she does not read them start to finish. She picks one at random and reads it slowly, and the person who wrote it is present in the room with her in a way that a telephone call never quite achieves. She would find your messages baffling and sad in equal measure. Not the fact of them, but the brevity of them, the way they arrive and are read and disappear, leaving almost no trace, no object, nothing that can be held or returned to or kept in a box. She would understand the speed of it. She would see the usefulness, but she would keep coming back to the vanishing, to the fact that you can say something to someone you love and there will be nothing left of it by morning, nothing physical, nothing that smells faintly of a perfumed envelope, or shows the particular pressure of a hand that was tired or hurrying or happy when it wrote. She would take out a piece of her own stationery and write someone a letter while she was visiting you. She would sit at the kitchen table with her good pen, and she would write, not quickly, with the particular stillness of a person doing something that asks for their full attention. She would seal it and address it in her neat hand and ask where she could find a stamp. And watching her, you would feel something you did not expect. Not nostalgia exactly, but something closer to recognition. The sense that here was a form of care you'd let go of so gradually you had not noticed it leaving. A form that required time and effort and the willingness to be known slowly, across the distance, in the ordinary faithful way of someone who picks up a pen and begins. She watches the sky. She has always watched the sky. She knows the particular heaviness of the air before a storm, the way the birds go quiet, the way the light changes at the edges. Her husband's knees are something of a weather system on their own. She checks the newspaper forecast, but she holds it loosely, because the sky has its own opinions and she's learned to read them. The idea of a small device in her pocket delivering her a precise, hour-by-hour forecast for the next 10 days, updated in real time, telling her not just that rain was coming, but exactly when it would arrive and how long it would stay, would have delighted her in a way that few things could. She would have checked it every morning. She would have trusted it the way she trusted her best recipes. And she would have felt, for the first time in her life, like the sky owed her a little less worry. She plans around the weather the way she plans around everything, carefully and with contingencies. A picnic needs a clear Saturday, and a clear Saturday is not guaranteed, only hoped for, which means there is always a version of the plan that involves the kitchen table instead of the park, and she has learned to hold both plans at once without minding. She hangs her laundry with one eye on the clouds. She plants her garden by the feel of the season. She carries an umbrella in May, not because she knows it will rain, but because May is May, and you carry one. When you show her the forecast on your phone, she would lean in very close and look at each hour, at the small icons of sun and cloud, and the numbers beneath them, and she would be very still for a moment, the way she is still when something is landing. Then she would ask you to scroll forward. She would want to see Thursday. She would want to see next week. And when you showed her, she would trace the days with one finger, not touching the screen, just moving alongside it, and she would say, very softly, all 10 days. She would want to know how it knew. You would try to explain it, the satellites, the instruments, the models running calculations across thousands of data points, and she would follow as far as she could follow, and then she would nod with the graceful acceptance of a woman who understands that she does not need to know how the engine works to appreciate that the car runs. What she would love most, you think, is the freedom of it, the way it removes a particular low-grade uncertainty that has simply always been part of planning anything. She would love knowing whether to bring the washing in. She would love knowing whether to start the pot roast or wait. She would love the way it turns the sky from something you read anxiously into something you could answer back to, something that, for once, told you what it was going to do before it did it. She would check it again that evening before bed. She would look at tomorrow's forecast the way she looked at tomorrow's schedule, making her small adjustments, her quiet preparations, already thinking 2 steps ahead in that efficient and unhurried way she had. She would set the phone down on the table and smooth her hands against her apron and say, "I would have used that every day of my life," and you would know she meant it, not as wistfulness, as pure, clear fact. Sunday is the backbone of her week, not just the rest, but the ritual, the particular weight of the morning, the way the whole family moves differently on a Sunday, slower and more deliberate, cleaner and more purposeful. The church is where she sees her neighbours not as neighbours, but as something larger and more permanent. It is where the seasons of life are marked. Baptisms, confirmations, funerals, the steady procession of ordinary people making meaning together in the same room, week after week, year after year. The idea that one day a majority of people in her own country might not attend services at all, might sleep through Sunday mornings or spend them at brunch or on a hiking trail, without guilt and without much notice, would have shaken something deep in her sense of what holds a community together. She does not go to church because she is told to. She goes because the week has a shape, and Sunday morning is where the shape begins. She goes because there is something that happens in a room full of people who have agreed, without negotiating it, to stop and be still together, to set down the week and its demands, and sit for an hour in the presence of something larger than their own particular worries. She goes because the singing matters, even when she is not sure of the words, even on the mornings when her voice is thin, and the pew is hard and the sermon runs long. The singing matters because it is her voice joined to the voices of people she's known for years, people who were at her wedding and her mother's funeral and the baptisms of her children, and that joining is not nothing. It is in fact quite a lot. She dresses for it. The children dress for it. This is not negotiable in her household, not because God requires particular clothing, but because the occasion requires a certain seriousness, a visible acknowledgement that Sunday morning is different from the rest of the week. She irons on Saturday evenings. She polishes the shoes. She checks the collars and the hems with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who understands that how you show up to something is part of how you mean it. After the service there is coffee in the fellowship hall, weak and reliable, poured from large silver urns into paper cups, and this is where the real work of the morning happens. This is where you learn who has been ill, and who has had a grandchild, and whose roof is leaking, and who could use a meal brought over on Thursday. This is the information exchange that keeps a neighbourhood functioning. The informal web of mutual attention that does not require a telephone tree or a newsletter, because everyone is simply in the same room every week, and the conversation does what it has always done. She would walk into a church on a Sunday morning in your time, and she would stop just inside the door and look at the pews, at how many of them were empty, and she would not say anything for a moment. She would just look, the way you look at a table set for more people than showed up, with a quiet and private kind of grief that she would not impose on you. She would not assume that the empty pews meant no one believed in anything. She was too thoughtful for that easy conclusion. But she would wonder where people went instead, on Sunday mornings in the future, and what they found there that gave the week its shape. What room they sat in together, what they stopped for, what they agreed without negotiating to call sacred. She would want to know if there was something that gathered people reliably, weekly, in the same place, for the purpose of being together in a way that was not about productivity or consumption or entertainment, but simply about the acknowledgement that a life requires more than the practical. She would hope there was. She would hope that people had found their version of the fellowship hall, their version of the weak coffee and the honest conversation, their version of the singing. She was generous enough to imagine it might look different from hers and still be real. But on the drive home from the church in your time, looking out the window at the Sunday morning streets, at the people jogging and the restaurants filling up and the ordinary weekend going about its business without pause, she would feel the absence of something she could not name precisely, only that it had to do with the specific piece of a morning that had been set apart, that belonged to no one's agenda, that asked nothing of you except that you show up and be still. She would fold her hands in her lap and look at the road ahead, and she would say, not to you exactly, just to the morning, I hope they have found somewhere to rest. In her world, children come early in a marriage, and they come because that is what marriage is partly for, the building of a family, the next generation arriving more or less on schedule, welcomed and expected and prepared for. A woman of 30 who had not yet started a family would be spoken of in careful tones, with a certain soft concern that did not quite say anything directly but communicated volumes. The idea that a woman might be 35 or 38 or 40, professionally accomplished, financially comfortable, choosing the right time, choosing her person carefully, living a full and deliberate life before introducing a child to it, would have seemed to her not like wisdom, but like something that needed explaining. She would sit with this for a long time before she said anything. She would ask questions first, the way she always does when something falls outside her experience. She would want to understand what a woman does with the years between 22 and 38, and you would tell her, and she would listen to all of it, the education and the career and the travel and the building of a self that belongs entirely to oneself before it belongs to anyone smaller and more dependent. She would find each piece of it reasonable. She would turn each piece over and see the sense in it. And then she would ask you, carefully, whether women were happy, not whether they were successful, not whether they were accomplished, whether they were happy. Because in her understanding, happiness has always lived close to the people you are responsible for, in the particular weight of being needed, in the texture of a life organized around others as well as yourself. She did not experience the early years of motherhood as a diminishment of herself. She experienced them as an expansion, a sometimes exhausting, often overwhelming, quietly magnificent expansion into something larger than she had been before. She would not say that your way was wrong. She was not a woman who dealt in those simple verdicts, but she would want to know if the waiting felt like freedom or like uncertainty wearing the clothes of freedom, and whether the years of choosing yourself had given you what you hoped they would, or whether they had given you something different, something harder to name, something that sat quietly in the evenings when the apartment was very still. She would look at a woman of 38, accomplished and careful, and still deciding, and she would see something she recognized, not the ambition, which was unfamiliar to her in its particular modern form, but the longing beneath it, the very human wish to have gotten more things right, to have arrived at the right moment with the right person with the right amount of certainty. She had felt that too, in her own way. She simply lived in a time that gave it fewer options and therefore perhaps fewer places to hesitate. She would reach across and touch the younger woman's hand, not to say anything, just to say, "I see you." The gesture would be brief and direct, and entirely without judgment, the touch of a woman who understood that every generation navigates its own version of the same longing, and that the forms change but the tenderness at the centre of it does not. She knows her music the way she knows her furniture, by feel, by familiarity, by the particular comfort of things that have been in the room long enough to belong there. She knows every word of songs she heard first as a girl. She hums while she irons. The radio in the kitchen plays the same stations that played when her mother had a kitchen of her own. Music in her world is something you could follow, something with a melody you could find your way back to, lyrics that told a story in plain language, the idea of the sounds that populate your world, the bass that moves through a phone speaker like a physical thing, the voices processed into something barely human. The beat that exists without a song built around it would have left her standing very still in the middle of a room, listening hard, trying to find the melody. She would not cover her ears. She was too polite for that, and too genuinely curious. She would stand there and listen the way she listens to anything new, with her head tilted slightly and her expression open, trying to find the thread of it, the place where the music became something she could hold on to. She would wait for the verse to resolve into something. She would wait for the chorus to arrive and repeat and give her a shape she could memorize. And after a while, if neither of those things happened, she would say, without unkindness, "I cannot find where it is going." She would understand rhythm. She was not a woman without a body. She would feel the pulse of certain things, and she would not pretend otherwise. But she would keep returning to the words, or rather to the absence of them, or to the words so altered by production that they cease to carry meaning the way words are supposed to carry meaning from one person's chest to another's. She would say, "But what is it saying?" not as a complaint, as a genuine question, because for her, a song was always saying something. Even the simplest ones, even the most sentimental ones were saying, "Here is a feeling I had, and I put it into this shape so you could have it too." She would ask you to play something you loved. She would sit down and listen properly, the way she listened to everything properly, with her hands in her lap and her full attention. She would try to hear what you heard in it. She would try to understand what it gave you, what it was for in your life, in your evenings, in the particular mood it found you in when you turned it on. And she would find something in that, even if she could not find the melody. She would find you listening. And that, she would decide, was what music had always been for. She would ask you to play something older, afterward, something she knew. And when the melody came in, familiar and clear, She would close her eyes for just a moment, and she would hum the first few bars very softly, and the room would feel different for it, warmer and more inhabited, the way a room feels when someone in it's completely at home. A woman alone in her world is a situation. It means something, or it suggests something, or it requires explanation. A widow, a spinster, someone between circumstances. The neighbourhood watches a lone woman the way it watches a single cloud, not with hostility, but with the quiet assumption that the natural condition is different from this, that the aloneness is temporary, that something must have gone wrong or must be in the process of being fixed. The idea that a woman might choose a one-bedroom apartment, decorate it entirely to her own taste, come and go as she pleased, cook or not cook, keep her own hours, answer to no one, and find in that solitude not loneliness but something closer to peace, would have required of her a long and careful rethinking of several things she had always accepted as simply the way things were. She would visit the apartment with genuine interest, taking it in the way she takes in everything, room by room, detail by detail, noting what was there and what it said about the person who chose it. She would see the single coffee cup on the drying rack, and the books arranged on their own terms, and the bed made with the particular neatness of someone who makes it only for themselves, because they like it that way, not because anyone is watching. She would see all of it, and she would be quiet for a moment, rearranging something inside herself. She would ask, "But do you not get lonely?" And the question would be genuine, not pointed. She would want to know the actual answer, not the one that defended the choice, but the one that told the truth about it, the whole truth, including the evenings when the apartment was very still, and the stillness was comfortable, and the other evenings when it pressed in close and felt like something she would not have chosen. You would tell her both, and she would listen to both with equal attention, not relieved by one and troubled by the other, but simply receiving the whole of it, the way she received most things, as information about the texture of a life, which is always more complicated than it looks from the outside. What she would revise sitting in that apartment with you is not her belief in togetherness, but her assumption about its only possible form. She had always understood a good life as one lived in the company of others, structured around the presence of people who needed you and whom you needed in return. What she would begin to understand, slowly and with some effort, is that the needing and the being needed can take many shapes, that a woman alone is not necessarily a woman without those things, that community can exist outside the walls of a shared household, that a person can be known and loved and woven into the fabric of other lives without living inside any of them. She would look around the apartment one more time before she left, at the single coffee cup, at the books, at the window with its particular view, chosen by someone who knew exactly what she wanted to look at in the morning. And she would nod just slightly to herself. The nod of a woman updating something she had long held as settled. It would cost her something, that small revision, but she would make it willingly because she was that kind of woman, one who had always believed that understanding was worth more than being right. Her house is never completely silent, but it has a particular kind of quiet that she does not notice until it's gone. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock in the hallway, the muffled sound of a neighbour's lawnmower drifting in through the window on a Saturday morning. These sounds do not intrude. They are the texture of an ordinary day, and they leave enough room for thinking. She has thoughts that develop slowly, without interruption, while she folds laundry or shells peas or moves through the afternoon. The world you live in, with its notifications and alerts, and the constant incoming of information from every direction, The noise that follows a person from room to room and will not stop even when they ask it to, would have felt to her not like being connected, but like being unable, ever, to hear yourself think. She would spend an hour in your world and come away with something like a headache, except that it was not exactly physical. It was more like a fullness, a sense of having taken in more than could be comfortably held. She would sit down in the quietest corner she could find and press her hands flat against her thighs and breathe. And in that moment she would look less like a woman from the past and more like a woman doing exactly what everyone around her needed to do and had forgotten was possible. She would ask you, practically, whether you could simply turn it off, and you would explain that it was more complicated than that. The way the noise was not one thing but many things layered together. The phone and the television and the open browser and the background music and the alert that came through even when everything else was quiet. And she would follow this explanation and then she would say, "But you could turn it off. You could, if you chose to." And she would not be wrong, and that would be the part that stayed with you. She understood quiet as a resource. This would be the thing she could not quite translate into your vocabulary. The way her generation understood silence not as the absence of something, but as the presence of something. A thing with texture and value. A thing you could think inside of, rest inside of, recover inside of. Her house was quiet in the afternoons, not because nothing was happening, but because she had organized her life in a way that protected certain hours from filling up. And she had done this not as a philosophical stance, but simply as the way a person kept their mind in working order. She would turn off your phone for you if you let her. She would do it the way she did most practical things, without ceremony or announcement, just a quiet action taken because it needed taking. And then she would make you sit in the resulting quiet for 10 minutes, and she would sit with you, and she would not fill the time with talking, because she understood that silence shared is different from silence endured alone. At the end of the 10 minutes she would look at you with the particular expression she reserved for things that had turned out to be simpler than expected. She would not say anything grand. She might say, "There it is," meaning the quiet, meaning the place where your own thoughts were, meaning the thing that had been there all along, waiting just beneath the noise, patient as water, ready the moment you stopped filling the space above it. Her tomatoes come from her garden, or from the farm stand 2 miles up the road, and she knows, within a day or two, when they were picked. She knows the names of certain farms the way she knows the names of neighbours. The seasonality of food is not a philosophy for her, it is simply a fact. The way strawberries belong to June and squash belongs to October, and expecting otherwise would be like expecting the calendar to run backward. The idea of standing in a produce aisle in January, handling a mango from one country, a pepper from another, a bag of grapes that travelled 5,000 miles to get to your hand, all of it available in the same refrigerated room in the same moment, would have stopped her mid-reach, produce in hand, trying to reckon with a world in which distance had become irrelevant to dinner. She would pick up the mango and turn it over in her hands. She would smell it, because that is always the first thing she does with a piece of fruit, and the smell would tell her something, though not quite what the smell of a mango from her own climate would tell her if she had one. She would look at the small sticker on the skin, at the country of origin printed in letters almost too small to read, and she would stand there in the refrigerated aisle, doing a geography she had never needed to do before, trying to place the distance in her body, trying to feel the miles. She would not be ungrateful for the abundance. She had known seasons of genuine scarcity, winters when the root vegetables ran low, and the canned goods were all that stood between a good meal and a thin one, and she would not romanticize that. not even slightly. The fullness of your produce aisle would move her in a real way. She would walk slowly past the bins of winter citrus and the pyramids of imported stone fruit, and she would feel something close to awe, the awe of a woman who once planned meals by what the season permitted, and who now stood in a room where the season had been entirely abolished. But she would think about the tomato, her tomato, the one she picked warm from the vine in August, still holding the heat of the afternoon, and sliced onto a plate with nothing more than salt and a little pepper. She would think about how that tomato tasted, and she would look at the tomato in your produce section, large and uniform and available in January, and she would pick it up and smell it too. And the smell would tell her what the mango smell told her, that something had been traded for the distance, that the getting of things from very far away requires them to travel in a state that is not quite the state of ripeness, that the cost of having everything always is sometimes the flavour of having it exactly right. She would buy the tomato anyway because she was practical and because winter was winter. But she would do something with it that you might not expect. She would roast it. She would coax from it, through heat and time and a little olive oil, the concentration of flavour that the travel had thinned out, the way you coax warmth from a fire that has burned low. She would make something good from it, because that was always what she did. She worked with what she had. She did not wait for perfect. She made do with real. And sitting down to eat what she had made, she would look at you and say, "It is good." And then, after a moment, the August one is better. And you would know, without her needing to say more, exactly what she meant. She sets the table the way other people pray, regularly, intentionally, as a small act of faith that the family will gather, that the food will be ready, that the day will pause long enough for everyone to sit together and be in the same room at the same hour. The dinner table is not just where food is eaten. It is where the family is maintained, where the children learn how a conversation moves, how to listen, how to pass things and say thank you, how to be a person in the company of other people who love them. The idea that families in the future might routinely eat in different rooms at different times, each in front of a separate screen, with the table set for no one in particular, and the kitchen running mostly as a service operation, would have seemed to her not like a change in habit, but like a change in something far more fundamental. She would want to understand how it happened, not in accusation but in genuine curiosity, the way she was curious about most things that did not match her picture of how life was supposed to work. She would ask when the change began, and you would try to trace it for her, the longer hours and the different schedules and the children's activities that stretched into the evenings and the screens that made solitary eating feel less like solitude, and she would follow all of it, nodding, tracking the logic. She would see how each individual change made a kind of sense on its own, but she would keep coming back to the table itself, the physical fact of it, the chairs arranged around it in the particular formation that says, "This is where we are, this is where we belong, this is the place we return to at the end of the day and sort through whatever the day made of us." She understood the dinner table as a kind of daily ceremony, brief and unremarkable from the outside, but doing something inside the family that nothing else quite did. Something about the regularity of it, the way it happened whether or not anyone felt like it, whether or not the day had been a good one, whether or not there was much to say. You showed up, you sat down, you passed the bread. And in the showing up, something was said that words could not have said as efficiently. She would set your table herself on the evening of her visit without asking permission. She would find the plates and the glasses and whatever cutlery was in the drawer, and she would arrange it carefully, and she would put something in the middle of the table, a candle if she found one, or a small vase of whatever was growing, or simply a bowl of fruit from the counter, something that said, "This surface has been attended to. This meal matters." Then she would call everyone to dinner with the particular voice she used for calling people to dinner, not loud, not urgent, but carrying, the voice of a woman who expected to be heard and usually was, and sitting there at the table she had set, with the food she had made from what was in your kitchen in the ordinary evening light, you would feel something settle in the room, something that had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with the fact of being in the same place at the same time with nowhere else you were supposed to be. She would ask someone about their day. The someone would answer. The answer would lead somewhere. The conversation would find its own shape, the way it always did when people were fed and seated and facing each other with nothing between them. She would not say anything about it afterward. She would not need to. She would simply clear the plates with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had always known that some things worked, and that the knowing was enough. Work, in her understanding, is a place you go. It has an address. It has hours. A man leaves the house in the morning in a particular state, pressed and purposeful, and returns in the evening carrying the day on him, looser, tired, ready to come back into the life of the house. The going and the returning are part of how time is organized, how the household knows what part of the day it is, how the week has its shape. She has organized her own days around those departures and arrivals for so long that they have become part of her internal clock, as reliable as the percolator and the evening news. The idea that a person might wake up, make coffee, sit down at a desk in the spare bedroom, and conduct an entire professional life from that chair, attending meetings that exist only on a screen, communicating through typed words, never commuting anywhere, some days never going outside at all, would have left her with a question she might not have been able to phrase precisely, but would have felt clearly. How do you leave the day behind if you never actually went anywhere? She would stand in the doorway of your home office, which to her eyes looks like a bedroom that has had a desk moved into it, and not entirely committed to the change. She would see the computer, and the phone, and the papers, and the particular quality of concentrated stillness that a person working alone in a small room produces. She would see you in the middle of your day, dressed in something comfortable, speaking to a screen, and she would watch for a moment before you noticed her, trying to read the scene the way she read all scenes, from the details outward. She would have questions. She would want to know if the people on the screen could see you clearly, and whether that was enough to work alongside someone, whether you felt their presence or only their image. She would want to know what you did when something was confusing, whether you could lean over to the person next to you, and when you told her there was no one next to you, she would consider this with the particular seriousness she brought to information that changed her picture of something. She had always understood work as partly social, even work that was primarily solitary. The office was where you encountered the texture of other people's days, where you understood by proximity and small observation that you were part of something larger than your own particular task. She would wonder what was lost when that proximity was removed, what information you stopped receiving when the colleague at the next desk became a face in a small rectangle on a screen, what accumulated understanding of other people quietly dissolved when you were only ever in a room alone. She would not tell you to go back to an office. She was not the kind of woman who prescribed solutions to problems she did not fully understand. But she would open the window before she left the room, as if the outdoor air might do something the screen could not, as if the sound of the ordinary street below might remind you that the world was still out there, still going about its business, still available to anyone willing to step into it. You would open the window a little wider after she left, and the afternoon would come in, and it would help in a way you had not expected, in a way she'd known it would, because she'd always understood that a person needed the outside, not as an interruption, but as a reminder of the scale of things beyond the four walls of whatever you were working so hard inside of. She knows her mother's number by heart. She knows her doctor's number, the number for the church office, the number for the hardware store, the number for her sister-in-law 3 states away. These numbers live in her head the way addresses live in her head, not as data stored somewhere but as things she simply knows, the way she knows how to get to the grocery store or how many cups of flour the bread needs. The idea that a person might be unable to reach a single human being in the world without a charged battery in their pocket, that the numbers of the people they love most would be unrecoverable if the device were lost, would have struck her as a strange and somewhat alarming way to build a life, with all the most essential things held in something you could drop. She would test you, not unkindly, just with the matter-of-fact directness of a woman who likes to understand the actual shape of a situation. She would ask you to tell her your mother's phone number, and in the moment of your hesitation, she would see everything she needed to see, not judgment in her expression, exactly, but something like a quiet confirmation of a concern she had already begun to form. She would ask what you would do if the phone was gone, lost or broken or simply dead with no way to charge it. You would think about it honestly, and the answer would be uncomfortable in its truth. You would not know how to reach the people who mattered most to you. You would have to go somewhere and ask for help, or find a computer, or remember an email address, and even the email addresses you were not entirely sure of. She would listen to this, and she would be still for a moment, doing the calculation, measuring the vulnerability of it. She would not have understood the mechanism by which it happened. The gradual offloading of memory to the device, the way each small act of not remembering made the next one easier, until the numbers that had once lived in your head like furniture had been quietly moved out and replaced with a phone that held them instead. She would understand the convenience of it. She would see clearly why it happened, but she would also see clearly what it meant in the specific and practical terms she always preferred to the abstract ones, that a person had made themselves dependent on a single object for access to the people they loved, and that the object was very small and very easy to lose. She would make you memorize a number before she left. One number. She would decide which one it should be, the most important one, the one that mattered most, and she would make you say it back to her until you had it. The way she had made her children repeat things until the repetition had moved the information from the surface to somewhere deeper and more reliable. She would not frame it as an exercise. She would frame it as a small, sensible thing, the way keeping a spare key was a small, sensible thing, because the world was unpredictable, and a person who loved you should always be reachable. You would carry the number with you after she left, in the place in your mind where she had put it, and you would find, in the days that followed, that there was a particular comfort in knowing it was there, in knowing that this one connection at least lived inside you rather than in the glass rectangle in your pocket. She would have known that comfort well. She would have known it as simply the ordinary condition of being a person who had taken the care to remember what mattered. She does not experience her role as a diminishment. She experiences it as a life, full and demanding and hers, organized around the people she loves and the home she keeps, and the particular competence required to do both well. She is not performing smallness. She is performing something she was raised to value, and that the world around her values in return. The idea that the word housewife would one day carry an apology inside it, that women who chose the domestic life would feel the need to qualify it, to explain themselves, to say, "But I also," and "it is not just," would have confused and then saddened her, not because the world changed, but because she would have understood that what was lost was not just a role, but the dignity that had always belonged to it. She would want to show you what the work actually looked like, because she suspected that part of the problem was that no one had ever seen it properly. Not the romanticized version, not the advertisement version, with the gleaming appliances and the spotless dress, and the smile that suggests nothing in the kitchen has ever gone wrong. The actual version. The version where you're on your knees cleaning the bottom of the oven at 9 in the morning, because if you do not do it today, you will not do it until it becomes a problem, and you would rather do it before it becomes a problem. The version where you are managing a household budget with the precision of an accountant and the creativity of someone who has had to make $37 last until Thursday. The version where you are simultaneously a nurse and a negotiator and a scheduler and a cook, and the person who remembers every appointment and every preference, and every particular way each member of the family needs to be handled on a bad day. She would want you to understand the skill of it, not the sentiment of it, not the warmth and the cookies and the apron, but the actual cognitive and physical and organizational skill required to run a home well, to make it a place where people felt safe and fed and accounted for, where the 1,000 small daily needs of a family were met with enough competence that no one ever had to think about them. She had been told, in her time, that this was natural to women, instinctive, which always struck her as a way of making something difficult look effortless, in order to avoid acknowledging the effort. She would sit with the discomfort of the word, of hearing it spoken apologetically, and she would try to understand how it had come to this, how the thing she gave her life to had become something women felt they needed to distance themselves from in order to be taken seriously. She would understand the injustice that produced the distance, the years of women being held in the domestic sphere not because they chose it, but because nothing else was open to them, and she would feel the justice of the opening. She was not without imagination. She could see what had been wrong with the old world clearly enough, but she would hope, sitting with all of it, that the opening of doors had not required the closing of the one she'd walked through willingly, that the world had found room for both things, for the woman who left the house and the woman who kept it, for the value of public work and the equal value of private work, for a life built outward and a life built inward. She would hope the dignity had been preserved, even as the choice was expanded, and if she found it had not been, if she found that the word she gave her life to had become an embarrassment, she would feel something she did not often let herself feel, a quiet, clear anger, held with perfect posture, expressed in no raised voice, but there, unmistakably there, because she had worked hard, and the work had mattered, and she had always known it, even when the world forgot to say so. Travel for her is an undertaking. You plan for it weeks in advance. You pack carefully, because looking presentable on arrival matters, because travel is an event and events deserve a certain seriousness of wardrobe. A trip across the country means days on a train if you're lucky, longer by car, the landscape unreeling slowly past the windows, the distance made real by the time it takes to cross it. She has a sense of how big the country is because she has experienced the sitting and the passing and the waiting that the bigness requires. She knows the particular quality of light in the late afternoon of a long journey, the way it comes in low and golden through the train window and falls across your hands and the book in your lap, and you look up and the landscape outside is entirely different from the landscape you started in, and you feel the distance in your body as a real thing, a thing with weight and meaning. The idea that a person could eat breakfast in New York and have dinner in California the same day, travelling in a pressurised tube 35,000 feet above the ground, would not have amazed her less for knowing the mechanics. Some things stay astonishing no matter how many times you explain them. She would want to try it. You know she would. She was never a woman who turned away from the new out of stubbornness, only out of a careful need to understand it before she committed to it. She would ask you practical questions first. What do you bring? How early do you arrive? Whether the seats were comfortable and whether there was somewhere to put your coat. She would want to know the whole procedure before she entered it, the way she wanted to know a recipe before she began it. Not because she could not improvise, but because preparation was how she respected a thing. She would dress for it. Of course she would dress for it. She would not appear at an airport in anything she might wear to water the garden. She would choose something pressed and considered. Something with a jacket because you did not know who you might be seated beside. And she had always believed that presenting yourself well was a form of courtesy extended to everyone around you, not just yourself. She would carry a small bag packed with the precision of a woman who has thought about what she might need for 5 hours in a confined space and has provided for each possibility without overpacking. There would be something wrapped in wax paper in the bag. There always was. At the airport she would be patient and she would be observant. She would watch the other travellers with the quiet attention she brought to any new social environment, noting what people wore and how they moved and whether they seemed anxious or accustomed. She would be a little surprised by the casual dress, by the general air of people treating this extraordinary thing as though it were entirely ordinary, as though hurtling through the upper atmosphere were no more remarkable than taking the bus. She would find this both impressive and faintly sad, the way we always find it when wonder has been domesticated out of something. On the plane she would look out the window and she would not stop looking. This would be the thing that distinguished her from every other passenger on that flight, that she would treat the window as the gift it was, pressing her face close to the glass to watch the ground fall away, watching the city become a diagram of itself and then disappear into the patchwork of the continent below. She would watch the clouds from above, which she had never done, and the experience of seeing them from the top rather than the bottom would quiet her in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular hush that comes over a person when the world shows them something they did not know was possible to see. She would not sleep on the flight. She would not understand sleeping on the flight. Every minute of what was visible from that window would seem to her a reason to stay awake, because she would know, in a way that perhaps only someone from her time could know, what it had cost the generations before her to cross this same distance, what it meant in days and discomfort and uncertainty, and she would feel that knowledge as a kind of obligation, an obligation to witness, to not waste the looking by closing her eyes. When the wheels touched down in California, she would let out a breath that she'd been holding, not from fear, but from the sustained concentration of someone who had been paying complete attention to something for 5 hours and was only now releasing it. She would gather her bag and straighten her jacket and look out the window at the California light, which was different from the light she left this morning, softer and more golden and carrying a warmth that the east had not had. She would stand up when it was time to stand up, and she would move with the crowd through the aisle and into the terminal, and she would find a quiet spot and she would simply stand there for a moment, letting it settle. That she had been on the other side of the country this morning. That breakfast had been in one world and this was another. That the distance her grandmother had never crossed in a lifetime had taken her 5 hours in a window seat. She would not say anything dramatic about it. She was not a dramatic woman. She would simply look at the California afternoon coming through the terminal windows, and she would say, quietly and with complete sincerity, "Well, that is something," and it would be enough, because she would mean it the way she meant everything, entirely, without performance, from the very centre of herself. She knows how to read a person in the first 30 seconds of meeting them, and a large part of what she reads is in the handshake. Whether a person offers their hand first or waits, whether the grip is firm or soft, whether they hold your gaze or look slightly to the side. These things tell her something about who she is dealing with, and she believes that a person can be trusted to some extent by how they conduct themselves in the small social rituals that cost nothing but reveal everything. She does not think about this consciously any more than she thinks consciously about breathing. It is simply part of how she moves through the world, reading people at the door, at the counter, at the church social, calibrating her trust and her warmth according to the small but legible evidence of the first encounter. The idea of a world in which a handshake might be considered a health risk, where people greet one another with a wave from a distance or a nod or an emoji on a screen, where the physical act of meeting might be opted out of entirely, would have seemed to her not like a reasonable caution, but like a world that had grown strangely shy of itself. She would extend her hand to you when she met you, as she extended her hand to everyone, with a directness that was neither aggressive nor uncertain, but simply present, simply there, the gesture of a woman who had decided long ago that meeting another person was worth the small ceremony of a proper greeting. Her handshake would be firm without being effortful. It would last exactly the right amount of time. It would be accompanied by eye contact and a phrase of genuine welcome. Not a formula, but an actual acknowledgement that you were there and that she was glad of it. She'd been taught this. Her mother had taught her and her mother's mother before that, the understanding that the handshake was not merely a social convention, but a form of communication that could not be replicated by any other means. It said, "I am here. I see you. I am not afraid of you, and I do not wish you to be afraid of me." It crossed the distance between two people in a single gesture and established something, a beginning, a small contract of mutual recognition that the rest of the relationship could be built upon. She took it seriously because she took people seriously, and meeting a person was always, to her, a serious thing. She would be disoriented by the alternatives. The wave from across the room, the nod, the raised chin that passed for acknowledgement among people who'd decided that acknowledgement should cost as little as possible. She would not find these rude, exactly, but she would find them incomplete, the way a sentence is incomplete when it stops before the verb. She would keep feeling the absence of something in each encounter, the small gap where the handshake should have been, and she would understand in that gap what the handshake had always actually been doing. She would wonder too what people learned about each other now in those first 30 seconds, without the evidence of the hand. She had always thought you could tell a great deal from a handshake, things people did not intend to tell you, things they might not have known about themselves, whether they were nervous, whether they were kind, whether they were the kind of person who made you feel seen, or the kind who made you feel managed. All of that lived in the hand, and without it, you were left with surfaces only, with whatever the face was choosing to show you, which was always the most controlled and least revealing part of a person. She would not stop extending her hand. Whatever the custom of the room, she would offer hers, and most people receiving it would take it, because the offer of a hand is difficult to decline gracefully, and because somewhere beneath the habits of your time there is still something that responds to the gesture. still something that knows what it means to be met properly. She would shake your hand again when she left, and in the leaving handshake as in the arriving one, you would feel something clear and human pass between you. The thing the gesture had always been for. The small, reliable confirmation that two people had been in the same room and had acknowledged it, honestly and without distance, in the oldest and simplest way one person can acknowledge another. She dresses from a store she can walk to, or nearly. She knows the women who work in certain departments by name. She knows which floor has the good housewares, and which salesperson will let her take her time without hovering. The department store is not just a place to buy things, it is where she brings her daughters to learn what quality feels like, to understand the difference between something made to last and something made to seem like it will last. It is where she goes on a slow Saturday with her sister, not necessarily to buy anything but to look, to touch the fabric, to feel the afternoon become something pleasant. The counters are long and glass-topped and lit from within, the cosmetics arranged like a small and serious museum of a certain kind of feminine aspiration, and she moves past them with the appreciative attention of someone who has never entirely lost the pleasure of beautiful things, even when she does not intend to buy them. The idea that she could sit at home and order anything she wanted from a catalogue on a glowing screen, without speaking to anyone, without going anywhere, and have it arrive at her door in 2 days, wrapped in paper and ready, would have seemed to her like a miracle delivered with something missing. She would want to take you to a department store on one of the ones that remained, if you could find one together worth the visit. She would dress for it, because she always dressed for it, and she would expect you to make a small effort too, not formally, but enough to show the store the same respect you showed a guest in your home. She would walk through the entrance with the particular ease of a woman returning to familiar territory, and for a moment, beneath the lights and among the counters, she would look entirely at home in a way she had not looked anywhere in your time quite so completely. She would want to feel the fabric before she considered anything. This would be the first principle, the thing she had always done and that no screen could replicate, running her fingers across the material with the practiced assessment of a woman who knew what she was feeling for, who could tell by touch whether something would hold its shape past a season, whether the weave was tight enough to earn the price, whether the hand of the cloth matched what the label was claiming. She would feel things you walked past. She would stop at a table of folded goods and lift each one with a brief, expert attention, setting aside the ones that told her nothing worth knowing and pausing over the ones that did. She would talk to the salesperson, not to be sold to, but because a salesperson who knew their floor was a resource, and she had always known how to use a resource well. She would ask questions that showed she knew what she was asking about, and the salesperson, if they were good at their work, would respond in kind, and the exchange would become a small, satisfying conversation between two people who both understood the thing they were discussing. You would watch her move through the store, and you would see something that was easy to miss in the ordinary rush of commerce, that shopping done this way was a form of attention, a form of being present in a room and in a transaction, of treating the objects you brought into your home as things worth choosing carefully, of understanding that the choosing was part of the having, that something was lost when you handed that part of the process to an algorithm that knew your past purchases and predicted your future ones. She would not buy much. She rarely bought much, because she was careful with money in the particular way of a woman who had learned to be, and because buying carefully meant not buying often. But what she bought, she would hold in both hands on the way to the counter, and she would feel good about it, and you would understand, watching her, that she felt good not despite the care it had taken, but because of it. On the drive home, she would hold the bag on her lap. She would not open her phone. She would look out the window at the afternoon, and she would be, in the quiet and specific way she was always fully whatever she was, entirely satisfied. She does not need to be told to drink water. She drinks water because she is thirsty, and when she is thirsty, she goes to the kitchen and drinks it, and then she goes back to what she was doing. This is not a wellness practice. It is just what a person does. The idea of a world in which people carry large insulated bottles everywhere they go, track their water intake in an app, receive notifications from their phone reminding them to hydrate, attend to the colour of certain things as a diagnostic measure, and spend money on water that has been filtered and mineralised and placed inside a branded container would have made her set down her glass of plain tap water and look at it for a long moment, trying to understand what had happened between her time and yours to make the simplest human instinct into something requiring management. She would pick up one of the large insulated bottles, the kind that held enough water to supply a modest luncheon, and she would turn it over in her hands with the expression she reserved for objects whose purpose she could identify, but whose necessity she could not quite justify. She would read the label, if there was one, and the label would tell her about the steel and the insulation, and the hours the temperature would be maintained, and she would absorb all of this information, and then she would set the bottle down and look at her own glass, 8 ounces, plain, from the tap, sitting on the counter where she had left it. She had a glass of water in the morning. She had a glass with meals. She had one in the afternoon if the day was warm and she'd been on her feet. She had one before bed because she had read somewhere that it was sensible. This did not feel to her like a regimen. It felt like being a person with a body, which was all it had ever been. She would be genuinely puzzled by the app. You would show her how it worked, the circles that filled as you logged each glass, the notification that arrived if you'd been too long between entries, the small congratulatory animation that played when you hit your daily target. She would watch all of this with the focused attention she brought to demonstrations of things she did not understand, and then she would ask, "But do you not simply feel it? When you need water, do you not feel it?" And you would have to think about that honestly, about whether you did, and the honest answer would be complicated, because the truth was that somewhere in the business of the day, with the screens and the meetings and the noise and the coffee, the quieter signals of the body had a way of going unheard until they were quite insistent, and by then you had been not quite thirsty for hours without knowing it. She would listen to this and she would understand it, not as a personal failing, but as a consequence of the same general condition she'd been observing all along, the way the modern life had arranged itself so thoroughly around the mind that the body had become something you had to be reminded to attend to. She would refill her own glass and drink it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the yard, and she would be so entirely in that moment, so simply present to the small animal fact of being thirsty and then not thirsty, that it would look almost like a practice, almost like something deliberate. But it was not deliberate. It was just what it had always been, a person, a glass, the plain, reliable fact of a body that knew what it needed if you were quiet enough to hear it asking. She would not tell you to throw the bottle away. She was not that kind of woman, but she would suggest gently that you try leaving it on the counter for a day, just one day, to see if you remembered without it, to see what else you might notice in the small gaps between reminders, if the reminders were not there to fill them. She goes to bed at a reasonable hour because there is nothing to stay up for. The television goes off. The house quiets. The day has been long enough that the body simply wants what it wants, and what it wants is rest. She does not lie awake scrolling. She does not have a screen to take to bed. She does not receive messages after 9 o'clock because the phone is in the hallway and the neighbourhood knows better. She sleeps the way a person sleeps when they have moved through the day with their body, done something physical and real, and arrived at the end of it genuinely tired. The idea of a world in which people struggle nightly to stop their minds, in which an entire industry exists to help people rest, in which sleep is something to be optimized and tracked and improved upon, would have told her something true and a little heartbreaking about what the future gained and what, perhaps, it quietly gave away. She would sit on the edge of the bed in the evening, and she would do the things she had always done. She would take out her hairpins one by one, setting them in the small dish on the nightstand where they had always gone. She would smooth her hands with lotion from the bottle she kept there, working it into her knuckles and her fingers with the slow attention of someone who understood that hands that had worked all day deserved a moment of consideration at the end of it. She would turn down the covers on her side and then, because it was simply what she did on the other side too, then she would turn off the lamp. The room would be dark, not completely dark because there was the window with its thin line of streetlight along the edge of the curtain, and that had always been enough. A landmark in the darkness, something to orient by if you woke in the night. She knew the sounds of her house the way she knew everything she lived with closely. The particular creak of the hallway floorboard, the way the heat came on in a certain pattern, the sound the wind made against the north window versus the south one. These sounds were not interruptions. They were the house continuing to be itself around her, and she found them, as she'd always found them, a kind of companionship. She would be asleep within 20 minutes. This was not a gift or a talent. It was the result of a day that had asked something real of her body, that had kept her moving and doing and attending from the early morning until the reasonable evening, so that when she finally lay down there was no question of what came next. The body knew. The body had been waiting patiently for the moment when she finally agreed to stop. She would not understand your sleeplessness at first. She would try to locate the cause of it the way she located the cause of any household problem, practically and without drama. You were not tired enough, perhaps, or you had drunk coffee too late, or the room was too warm. She would offer each of these possibilities with the helpful directness of a woman who believed that most problems had solutions, if you were willing to look at them clearly. But as you described it more fully, the lying awake with the thoughts arriving in a stream that would not slow, the way the mind in your time seemed to have forgotten how to stop at the end of the day, how to accept the dark and the quiet as a signal that the processing was done for now, she would grow quieter. She would begin to understand that this was not a logistical problem but something more like a condition of the whole way the day was structured, that the mind you brought to bed with you was a mind that had been interrupted and stimulated and demanded of every waking hour, that had never been given the long stretches of gentle, undirected time that allow a mind to gradually spend itself down toward readiness for rest. She would think about her afternoons, the ones that seemed, to your eyes, unproductive, the ones where she simply moved through the house doing small things, or sat for a while with a cup of tea and nothing in particular to think about, or walked to the mailbox and stood for a moment in the yard just standing. She had never thought of those as preparation for sleep. She had just thought of them as the afternoon. But she would begin to understand, sitting in your sleepless evening, that they might have been exactly that, the slow unwinding that made the winding down at night possible, the hours of ordinary quiet that gave the mind somewhere to settle, long before the pillow received it. She would not be able to give you back the afternoons. She knew that. She was a practical woman, and she understood that the shape of your day was not a thing she could simply rearrange from the outside. but she would do one thing before she went to her own room. She would take your phone from the nightstand where it sat charging beside you, and she would put it across the room on the dresser out of arm's reach, and she would look at you with the firm and affectionate expression of a woman who had made a decision on your behalf and was not going to apologize for it. Then she would say goodnight, and she would mean it the way she meant everything, as a real wish, genuinely offered for something she hoped you would actually receive. The good night, the real one, the one that comes when the day has been lived fully enough that the body is willing finally to let it go. She'd always known how to find it, and standing in the dark doorway of your room, she would hope very much that you would find it too. She has a drawer in the kitchen devoted entirely to stationery, and inside it, organised by occasion, are the thank you notes. Not cards purchased at the last minute from a rotating wire rack. Proper notes, with a weight to the paper and a modest but deliberate design, chosen because they suited the purpose, because sending a thank you note was not a formality she discharged grudgingly, but an act she performed with genuine intention. The way she performed all the small social courtesies that held the fabric of a community together without anyone noticing, until the day they stopped. She writes them within 48 hours. She writes them by hand, in full sentences, naming the specific thing she is grateful for, because a thank you that does not name the thing is not really a thank you, but only the shape of one. The idea that people in the future might receive a gift, attend a dinner, experience a kindness, and mark the occasion with nothing more than a few words typed on a phone and sent before the thought had fully formed, or with nothing at all, would have grieved her in a way she would have been too gracious to say directly. She would sit at your kitchen table, and she would write one while she was visiting. You would ask her who it was for, and she would tell you. Someone who had done something kind for her earlier in the week, something small that most people would not have noted. She would have the person's address from memory, or she would ask you to help her find it, and she would write the note in the careful, unhurried way she wrote everything by hand, the pen moving at the pace of actual thought, rather than the pace of a thumb on glass. You would watch her, and you would feel, as you'd felt watching her do several things, that there was a quality of attention in the act that was entirely absent from its modern equivalent. She was not multitasking. She was not composing the note while also half watching something on a screen or half listening to something through earbuds. She was simply writing a note, with all of herself present to the writing of it, thinking about the person as she wrote, choosing words that were true, making the letter into a small and genuine record of the fact that someone had been kind, and that she had noticed, and that the noticing mattered enough to commit to paper and send across the distance between them. She would address the envelope with the same care. The full name, the full address, each line sitting where it should sit, written in the hand that was recognizably hers, that carried within it 40 years of letters written in the same style, the same slight forward lean, the same deliberate spacing between words that said, without saying anything, that the person holding the pen had time for you, that you were worth the time. She would ask you for a stamp. You might not have one, and the search for the stamp would become its own small adventure, rummaging through drawers for something that in her world lived in a specific place, and was never misplaced because it was always needed. When you found one, she would press it into place with her thumb, the small, decisive gesture of a woman completing something properly, and she would set the envelope on the counter near the door so that she would not forget to mail it on her way out. She would wonder, before she left, whether the person who received it would know what to do with it, whether they would hold it a moment before opening it, as she held letters before opening them, with that small anticipatory pleasure of something that had come through the mail, specifically for you, with your name on the front in someone's actual hand, whether they would read it slowly, as it deserved to be read, or quickly, as everything in your time tended to be read, whether they would keep it or set it aside, or let it be shuffled beneath other papers until it was lost. She would hope they kept it. She would hope they put it somewhere they would find it again in a year or two, in a drawer or tucked inside a book, and that finding it would give them, briefly and unexpectedly, the feeling of being remembered by someone who had taken the time to say so properly. She had received notes like that herself, notes she had found years later and read again as though for the first time, and they had given her something that no other form of communication had ever quite replicated. The feeling of being worth the effort of the good paper and the good pen, and the 48 hours and the stamp. She would know, walking out your door with the envelope in her hand, that she was carrying something small and almost absurdly simple, a folded piece of paper with a few sentences on it, addressed to one person, saying one true thing. She would know that in your time it would arrive like a small artifact from another era, something the recipient might not entirely know how to receive, but she would send it anyway, because that was the whole point of it. Not that it was easy, or fast, or convenient, but that it was real, and that real things, sent with care, had a way of arriving exactly where they were needed, even across the distance of all the years between her time and yours. Her mother lives 11 minutes away by car, or 25 on foot, a walk she's made so many times that her feet know the route without her having to think about it, down the block and left at the elm tree and past the house with the blue shutters and up the 2 porch steps. She goes on Tuesdays usually, and sometimes on Thursdays if there is a reason, and the visits are not occasions, they're just Tuesdays. Just the ordinary maintenance of proximity, the cup of coffee, and the conversation that does not need to be about anything in particular, because the point of it is not information, but presence. The simple fact of being in the same room as someone you love, regularly enough that neither of you has to wonder about the other in the long spaces between. She would not understand at first the geography of your life, the way the people who mattered most to you were distributed across the country in a pattern that followed careers and opportunities and the general modern willingness to go wherever the life seemed to be without quite accounting for the cost of the going. She would ask you where your mother lived and when you told her. She would ask how often you saw her, and when you told her that too, the number of times per year. She would be quiet in the way she was quiet when information required her to revise something she had held as simply the natural order of things. She had never considered living far from her mother as a possible choice, not because she lacked imagination, but because the question had never presented itself to her in those terms. You lived where your people were, or you stayed where you'd been planted, and the life grew up around the proximity, tangled and inconvenient and sustaining in the way that only things grown close to their roots can be sustaining. The idea of choosing a city because of what it offered professionally, independently of where your family was, would have seemed to her like choosing a garden for its view and forgetting to ask about the soil. She would want to know what you did when something went wrong. Not the large emergencies, those had their own machinery, but the small ones, the ordinary Tuesday of a bad week, the day when the body was tired and the mind was heavy, and what you needed was someone who had known you your whole life to sit across from you at a kitchen table without requiring an explanation. She would want to know where you went for that, and you would tell her honestly about the phone call or the video screen, about the voice in your ear while you sat alone in your apartment, and she would listen, and she would not diminish it, because she was not a woman who diminished things people relied on. But she would think about the 11-minute walk. She would think about what it gave her that could not be replicated through a speaker or a screen. The specific comfort of her mother's kitchen smelling the way it had always smelled, of the same soap and the same coffee, and something underneath that was simply the smell of a place where you had always been safe. She would think about the way her mother could tell, just by looking at her when she came through the door, whether she was all right or not quite all right, the way that kind of knowing lived in the eyes and required no words and no asking, only the long accumulated familiarity of two people who had been in and out of each other's presence for decades. She would grieve a little for the distance you lived with, not dramatically, not in a way that asked anything of you or made you feel the weight of what you had chosen, just quietly, in the way she grieved most things, privately and without imposing. She would grieve it the way she grieved the empty church pews and the missing letters, as one more piece of the particular closeness that had made her world feel, for all its limitations, like something held together from the inside. She would call her mother when she got home, 11 minutes away, and she would still call, just to say she was back, just to say goodnight, because that was the habit of someone who understood that the people you loved needed to hear your voice, not just on special occasions, not just in emergencies, but on the ordinary evenings, the unremarkable ones, the ones that did not seem to require a call, but that were, she had always known, exactly the ones that did. So here we are, at the end of the day. Not her day exactly, and not quite yours, but somewhere in the quiet space between them, where the two have been sitting together for a little while, getting acquainted. We walked through her kitchens and her grocery lists and her Sunday mornings. We sat at her table and wrote her letters and watched her hold the phone in both hands, turning it over with as patient, careful attention she brought to everything she did not yet understand. We watched her set the table without being asked, and open the window to let the afternoon in, and press a stamp into place with her thumb, and shake your hand at the door as though meeting you were something worth doing properly. She was not extraordinary. That is the whole point of her. She was an ordinary woman living an ordinary life in an ordinary time, and she did it with a steadiness and a care and a quiet competence that the world around her largely forgot to name because it was too busy being grateful for it. What she knew, and what she might want you to carry forward from this evening, is something very small and very old. That the day has enough in it, if you are willing to be in it. That the people around you are worth the good paper and the firm handshake, and the extra 20 minutes at the kitchen table. That the quiet, when you stop filling it, has something to say to you. That rest is not a reward. It is simply what a body needs when it has been honestly used. You do not have to live her life to live by that. Just slow down a little. Notice the room you are in. Think of someone you've been meaning to write